Last week, while everyone was scrutinizing the reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. Surgeon General was asking big tech for help. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy submitted a formal request for details about the scale of COVID-19 misinformation. This includes the number of users exposed to misinformation, the source, as well as information on people who sold unproven COVID products and treatments.
The deadline for big tech to comply is May 2nd, but there is no penalty if the request for data is denied. Joining us now to weigh in on this is Rachel Bovard, Policy Director at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Welcome, Rachel.
Good morning, guys.
And so, you know what sucks? Yeah. Big tech.
Big
like
tech.
Don't like them.
Big tech. And so, yeah, Rachel, this interview will not be broadcast on the big tech platform known as YouTube.com.
Our friends.
Robbie's friends over at YouTube.
Yes, friends like these.
Now that his book is out, they're like, we have no use for this guy.
Deplatform immediately.
Deplatform him right away.
Yes. Love being humiliated. Anyway, about this.
So big tech. We're talking about big tech, and they're being asked to let the Surgeon General know, how much, I guess, misinformation that they spread throughout the pandemic. What do you make of this request from Murthy?
Well, it's wildly inappropriate, but I would love to pretend this hasn't been happening. But this is PRISM all over again. I get asked a lot, why did you start getting interested in big tech to begin with? Well, it was the Snowden leaks. And what the Snowden leaks revealed were that these companies were doing exactly this. They were just doing it silently. They were throwing open the back door to the government for the government to troll their users, essentially, to gather intel on their users, photos, voice recordings, emails, all these things. Now, this request is just specific to COVID-19 misinformation, but it's the same premise. And now, instead of back in 2013 when it was a secret, right, and when it came out, everyone was outraged, people are just doing it in public. The aperture has widened so much that I think people understand that this hand-in-glove relationship between the tech giants and their business model, which is to gather all this information on you, now has a benefit to the government, and the government feels entitled to ask for it. And that's just shocking. It's just wildly inappropriate, and I hope these companies do push back very publicly.
Well, and there's such a weird, all-encompassing definition here, misinformation. Like, what does that even include? Because so much of what has been called misinformation and what was called misinformation on tech platforms, right, by the government and, at the government's behest, then by the platforms, some of what they were doing all along, they were being instructed, asked, in air quotes, by the government. But what about the lab leak? Is that they want information on the lab leak theory, the misinformation of the lab leak theory that now is not even considered misinformation because it's an open enough question whether that was the origin for COVID. So so much of this misinformation isn't even misinformation anymore.
Well, it goes to the idea that misinformation has been coming from the government itself, right? If the definition we're using of misinformation, are things that, were considered socially wrong and banned that are now socially allowed and we're allowed to talk about them. You have the lab leak theory. You have this idea that, if you remember, all these accounts were being banned for questioning whether the vaccine really did prevent the spread of COVID. We now know the CDC is like, actually, no, it doesn't. So again, these things have flipped because this is a virus that evolves and we learn new things. And science itself, the pursuit of scientific inquiry, is the overturning of what was considered conventional wisdom. And so I think to go in and just open the door and say, here's our definition of misinformation, give us all, the data on your users and the intel, is just completely inappropriate, for the reason you point out, but also just the premise itself. You should never be going and asking for this, to begin with. I just think, and this is the second time, by the way, the Surgeon General has done this. He did this again in July. When he put out like a 22-page manual about what misinformation looks like. You saw Jen Psaki demand that users get banned from the platform or from the podium at the White House. So this is I think for social media and tech companies, if they're going to make any kind of stand at all on behalf of their users, it has to be now.
And aren't there supposed to be two things that happen in response to something like this? Ideally, or in a different era, right, the companies just refuse because they say, no, we don't have to do that. And civil liberties organizations, right, are supposed to defend them against this kind of government, grabbing at information and at speech. But that's not happening, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, RIP the ACLU on this question and on so many questions. Because I think you do have this element in society. A lot of it, I think, exists on the left, although, Ryan, you may want to push back on that. This idea that, like, you can just police this speech, that some sort of speech is dangerous, that misinformation must be banned, that in America, we are suddenly not allowed to talk about what we want, to read what we want, to see information that we might disagree with. And that sort of cartel-like attitude toward what people say on social media is coming through the policy channels. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous development in sort of the idea of free speech in America.
Yeah, and I wouldn't really push back on that. There is a civil liberties faction within the left, but it is an increasingly small faction. In fact, there were a ton of people who are progressives and fans of this show said, really unfortunate what YouTube did to you, really idiotic that they did that, but I'm glad that they're cracking down on the orange man. So if you guys are collateral damage, then at least the orange man's getting the hammer. So yeah, there is a strong strain on the left that identifies exactly with what you just said. So in addition to demanding misinformation data from tech platforms, the Surgeon General is also asking healthcare providers and the public to submit details on how misinformation negatively impacted patients and their communities. I mean, these are things that it feels to me like if Johns Hopkins or other epidemiologists want to study this, that's a fine thing. And the New York Times publishes data on hospitalizations by vaccinated status and unvaccinated status, and I think there's a public health interest in finding out why it was that those people decided not to get vaccinated and the other people decided to, so that they can then hone their message for next time. I think the question is where the data comes from. I don't know. How do you?
Of course, when Cambridge Analytica claimed falsely, as it turned out, that it could that it sort of had gotten some information from Facebook on users and could use that to more accurately target campaign advertising, everyone in liberal world lost their mind at the threat to the existential threat because of that, which turned out to be not even something they could do and was not threatening whatsoever.
Right. No, it's just
kind
fake,
of funny.
Like normal fake stuff. Right, yeah. I mean, Rachel, what's appropriate to you? Obviously, to me, public health researchers are entitled to try to survey the public about their attitudes toward health measures.
Right.
So, but where is the line?
Yeah, private lines of inquiry, are welcome in America, right? To your point, if hospitals want to look into this, if public health or public health professionals want to look into it, that's one thing. But what we have now is the government not only directing these sort of private businesses, although I would even take issue with that moniker at this point, to open the door on their users, but they are now telling doctors and hospitals to narc on individual, patient anecdotes and to talk about misinformation in a way that the White House has framed for them. And so this whole COVID-19, speech crackdown has been about one thing, and that's about narrative control. And this is one more element that we're seeing. And the sort of shamelessness with which they go about it, I think, is the most disturbing feature. And I think this, frankly, I do think this has policy implications, because I do think any government, right, they are not going to willingly walk away from the ability to control what is said on some of the biggest speech platforms in the world. This is a bipartisan interest. You saw Donald Trump try to do this during the BLM riots to control what was put on Facebook, and now you're seeing the Biden administration do the same thing about COVID. No government is going to willingly relinquish that power. So I do think that there does need to be some policy parameters around the sharing of third-party data. Off these platforms, you're already seeing the government purchase bulk metadata on individuals sold by individual apps and platforms. That's a completely lawless space. And then on top of that, I also think there's implications for, down the road, the way that you sort of limit, if you are concerned about viral misinformation, which I think in some cases, can be a real threat. The way to deal with that is not to control what is said or try to limit speech or control speech or define it. It is you break the speech cartel entirely, right? The reason the Biden administration went to Facebook in July, they were the biggest platform they went to, is because they know that they control the discourse, right? There's a reason they're not focusing on Rumble, for instance. They're focusing on the biggest, the platforms who are the speech titans. If you break that monopoly control over the discourse, you have a little bit more decentralization here, then you are going to actually limit, by definition, how far viral misinformation can spread.
Yeah, and the whole approach feels too blunt to be serious. Like I said, I'm totally fine with public health officials studying public health attitudes. Like it's important for them. And it's even more important over the last 2 years because they obviously had no idea how to communicate with the public. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the situation they're in now. But it feels like
tech platforms just don't do a great job distinguishing actual misinformation from people just talking about the existence of misinformation.
I agree. Break up YouTube. I agree.
I'm not even going to say a word against it today. I'm just not in the mood. Let it go.
Fair enough.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Minnesota Congressman Ilhan Omar joins us in the studio next to discuss the White House's potential talks with Saudi Arabia amid the global oil and gas price surge. Stay tuned for that.